Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Rural Communities and Social Media webinar. I am Hannah Becker. I'm the Creative Director at Aboutcker Digital, and I'll be leading today's discussion on rural informed social media strategies. So just to kind of give you a brief overview of what we're going to be going over today, we're going to do kind of a quick introduction to the modern rural American population. We're going to talk about some misconceptions regarding social media usage and habits in rural communities. We're going to talk about the preferred social media platforms of rural residents. Also, look at some recent changes in social media usage among rural communities and talk about how that'll impact our future. And then also give you some actionable ways that you and your organization can adopt a rural informed social media strategy that will help you build those connections and improve outreach initiatives. So just to give you a quick intro to Aboutcker Digital, we are located in the beautiful mountain town of Buena Vista, Virginia, which is nestled up right off the Blue Ridge Parkway. We provide marketing and public relations services to government agencies and nonprofit organizations. We are SWAM certified by the state of Virginia, micro, small, and service disabled veteran owned. And then we are also federally certified through the SBA as a hub zone small business and CVE verified service disabled veteran owned small business. So our website is down here, Aboutcker-digital.com. On our website, we have a ton of free resources. We've got webinar recordings, blog posts, a podcast that we're entering our second season on. And these resources are available online for free, and they go into much more detail on some of the topics that we're going to talk about today: marketing to rural communities, disability inclusive communications, that type of thing. So if that interests you, check that out. And then just wanted to briefly go over some of our services. Like I said, marketing and public relations, we really specialize in going beyond the screen to engage communities and develop meaningful relationships for our client organizations and agencies. We do this by utilizing communication tools like social media, public relations, and digital storytelling, to accomplish that objective. A few areas of expertise that we have past performance with, government and nonprofits include communications specific to rural populations, multi-generational audiences, the disability community, and military and veteran populations. Just to give you a little bit about my background, rural communities are near and dear to my heart. I grew up in a small farming community where everybody knew their neighbors. The feed store was pretty much the center of community life. And that's an experience that I really cherish, and has also shaped my career. I went off to Mississippi State University and graduated with a bachelor's degree in animal and dairy science. And I actually worked in agriculture for several years and was recognized as a master cattle producer, making me one of the first female cattle producers in the state to be recognized with that acknowledgement. So I was very excited about that. I then went on to graduate with a master's of business administration from Florida Institute of Technology, a graduate certificate in nonprofit management, and I'm currently wrapping up a master's of science and information technology, which is also from Florida Tech. I previously taught computer science and economics at multiple colleges and universities across the country. And today I work as the creative director for Aboutcker Digital, where I get to incorporate my rural community background and passion into client strategic communications and marketing campaigns, which is really rewarding work and kind of full circle from where I started out. Additionally, I serve as an outreach ambassador for Military Officers Association of America and am an adjunct professor professor at Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia, in the Economics and Business Department. If you have any questions about anything we go over today, my email is on the slide here. Feel free to reach out to me if I can help you. And also, I'm very active on LinkedIn and would love to connect there. So with that, we'll jump into our content. So when people from urban and suburban settings think of rural America, they may think of a homogenous group of farmers. However, that is a stereotype about rural America. As we begin today, I'd like to take a minute and kind of break down those stereotypes and give you some insight into who actually makes up the modern rural population and how influential rural communities are in our society today. So rural communities account for 97% of America's land mass and 20% of the country's overall population. These rural areas are crucial sources of water, food, energy, and recreation for all Americans. 10% of the country's GDP is actually generated in non-metropolitan counties, rural communities. Members of rural communities are more likely to own a home, they're more likely to reside in the state of their birth, and they are more likely to have served in the military than residents from urban areas. Veterans currently comprise 10.4% of the population of adults in rural areas. So having a veteran and military informed component to your rural marketing strategy, should be a priority given these demographics. The average age of rural residents is reported to be slightly higher than that of urban residents, but the difference is slight. We do have many millennials, many Gen Zers in rural communities, even though they are often left out of the conversation when it comes to rural marketing. Another interesting kind of insight into our modern rural communities is that rural areas are noted as having more entrepreneurial activity than urban areas. According to the Census Bureau, it is in fact non-metropolitan counties that have the highest rates of self-employed business owners. Rural businesses are reported to have higher survival rates over a 5-year period than companies that start in an urban area. So as a self-employed individual, I thought that was very interesting. And kind of insightful into the fabric of our rural communities and the values and lifestyle that is, observed there. Additionally, the disability rate in rural America is higher than it is in the total US population. So this is important in regards to making sure your organization's rural focused communication strategy is disability inclusive and accessible. If that concept is new to you, we're going to be hosting a webinar next month that will talk about 508 compliance and disability inclusive social media. So be sure to register for that. You can do that on our website. It's free, and it'll just be kind of a 15-minute overview of need to know about creating a disability inclusive communication strategy and some really helpful hints on just how you can do that with the resources that you have. Additionally, rural communities do tend to slightly lag behind urban and suburban areas in regards to internet access. However, internet connectivity is rapidly increasing in rural areas, and we'll see how that's played into some recent population shifts in rural America. So while the vast majority of America's population currently lives in urban areas, recent surveys have revealed that many urban residents report an interest in relocating to a rural community. Rural life often offers a lower cost of living, less crime, increased access to outdoor recreation, and an overall improved quality of life when compared to many urban areas. As the pandemic spread across the United States, we observed a drastic shift in migration patterns as urban dwelling residents sought out more rural areas in which they could live. These pandemic directed moves were prompted by the need to social distance, and they were powered by some professions' ability to work remotely. We'll see if these moves continue and if interest grows. Overall, the pandemic has impacted American society as a whole, and it really changed priorities and perspectives for so many. I know in our rural community here in the mountains of Virginia, we have seen many young professionals who work remotely relocate out of the city to live out here, enjoy the mountains, and work remotely, progress their career. Rural life, while it's not often marketed, rural life does offer a lot to millennials and Gen Zers that are looking for affordable places to live that offer that access to outdoor recreation and internet connectivity. So I want to talk a little bit about the role technology plays in rural communities and the role it's played historically, how that shapes today, what it'll look like in the future. And then we're going to dive right into social media specific stuff. So rural communities are active leaders in commerce, industry, and technology. Unfortunately, many professionals from other areas mistakenly believe that rural populations are not active online. And this is a misconception about rural populations that can really limit the effectiveness of rural focused marketing and outreach campaigns. I think this idea that rural areas are not online is just kind of further evidence of these misconceptions that surround rural communities and rural life. Agriculture, for example, one key industry in rural areas, is insanely technologically advanced. It's got biometric sensors, cloud computing, robots, temperature and moisture sensors, aerial images, and GPS technology. Rural communities in so many ways are dependent on tech, for survival. This is due to the disbursement of the population. For example, where I live in rural Virginia, there are many places I go about my day, whether it's driving across the mountain or out on the farm, out in the field, where there are no people, none. No people. I am dependent on technology for communications in those areas. So in this way, in rural communities, technology is really a tool, in addition to kind of a lifeline, a resource for information, entertainment, and socialization. And we'll get into that with social media. But at its core, it's really a tool to improve quality of life. So it's not that rural communities don't use technology. It's that they tend to use it a bit differently than urban communities might. And this is where it's so important for marketing professionals to understand these differences. And it's not a new phenomenon that rural communities using tech in a slightly different way than urban and suburban communities. In fact, rural communities are somewhat famous historically for using technology in novel ways. When the telephone first came to rural America in the early 20th century, rural communities applied the custom of visiting to it. Visiting. That's a term my grandmother used to often use. She would go visit, or she would get on the phone and visit with their friends, see what was going on in town. So back in the day, early 20th century, the telephones in rural areas was a system of rings, and these system of rings would signal an individual home on a party line. And the intent was when your system of rings, your cadence of rings came through, you would pick up. But in rural areas, when the phone would ring, people all over would just join in. They would eavesdrop. They would visit. This practice was so common in rural areas that the speakers would often adjust their conversations for larger audiences. They had a soapbox moment. This practice so irritated Bell Telephone that the company instructed rural customers to behave more like its urban ones. It said, stop visiting, only answer the phone which rings with your house. Stop visiting. Of course, that didn't go over very well. In the end, Bell Telephone actually recognized this visiting custom as a business opportunity within rural America, and they created a telephone specifically designed to support this rural custom. So it's just a little background, historical kind of anecdote to how rural areas have, over the past century or 2 centuries, differed somewhat on how they apply technology. So unfortunately, many misconceptions exist around how organizations can effectively connect with rural communities. I think this is kind of rooted in urban bias and marketing in general, and then also limited experience and accurate information, coupled with stereotypes and this popularizing or promotion of stereotypes related to rural communities. To be effective, though, in outreach and social media, organizations have to confront these type of misconceptions with accurate insights into our wonderfully diverse rural communities that contribute significantly to our nation's population and society. Here are just a few unfounded misconceptions about rural communities that I hear all the time in marketing and social media discussion. So I want to just briefly go through these, make sure, that just kind of dispel them so we can enter into how to, reach rural residents through social media with kind of open eyes. So one misconception is that rural populations are not online and will not be responsive to digital marketing strategies. And that is unfounded. Rural residents are very much online, and they are, when approached, effectively, can be extremely responsive to digital marketing strategies. Second misconception, rural communities are self-contained, insular, isolationist, and residents are not interested in outside offerings. This is a huge misconception. Rural communities use social media, use the internet to gather information about new products, new services, new organizations, new programs all the time. Misconception 3, rural populations only consume traditional media channels such as radio and newspapers. And this is untrue. We're going to look at the social media usage within rural communities, and you'll see that it is just behind that we observe in urban and suburban areas. Misconception 4, rural communities are homogenous in ethnicity, political affiliation, and religious beliefs. This also completely untrue. Our rural communities are incredibly diverse on multiple fronts, and stereotypes that just roll rural residents in this image of, an older white male farmer is completely unfounded. Our fifth misconception, rural populations are poorer than urban populations and thus not a viable market for-profit organizations. If you remember on our quick introduction, the modern rural community, rural residents are more likely to own a home than residents in urban and suburban areas. And this home ownership, affects net worth for rural residents. So they are not, en masse poorer than urban populations. It's just a different lifestyle. Can be, many different lifestyle differences here. So these misconceptions regarding our rural communities can really impair an organization's ability to connect with rural target audiences. Here's just kind of some rural community truths. Reality is the majority of residents in rural communities are active online, both using the internet to consume, information and social media. They display a vibrant interest in outside perspectives. They consume a variety of media channels, some traditional, some digital, and are increasingly diverse in culture and beliefs. When approached in a respectful, well-researched manner, rural communities can be very receptive audiences for organizations in a variety of sectors, government and nonprofit. Recognizing the differences that exist with incorporating customized marketing strategies can really help organizations improve their connections with rural populations. So let's talk a little bit about rural communities and social media. So rural communities are avid social media users. Smartphone ownership rates have risen sharply in rural areas over the past 10 years. Back in 2011, only 21% of rural residents had a smartphone. By 2019, 71% did. Also, tablet ownership has drastically increased. 2010, it was 1% in rural areas. By 2019, it was 49%. Rural populations are just slightly behind urban populations on device usage. Rural communities do use social media a bit differently than urban and suburban residents. We're going to talk about rural residents' preferred social media apps in just a minute. But first, I want to go over how they use social media somewhat differently than residents in urban areas, because I think these key differences are really important to understanding how to reach this population. In many cases, rural residents rely on social media now for what the newspaper used to provide. And this is everything from classifieds, community events, obituaries. They're using social media for community networking, socializing, and information sharing and researching. One thing that's interesting to me about rural residents is they go online less frequently than urban residents. They're very intentional about what they're doing on social media. It isn't as much entertainment as it is with intent, for a purpose. They're looking for something. They're trying to solve a problem in their own life, and they're going to social media to see what's there. You know, as in my work as a marketing professional, I've just noticed that rural residents tend to be a little more mission minded with their social media usage. When they're on there, they're looking for something specific. They're researching something specific. They're trying to solve a specific problem. I think that's really important to kind of keep in mind as you develop content for the rural populations. Here's just kind of a graph. Pew, I think this was 2019. No, it came out 2021, but it goes on up. And this light, like purple or gray line here is rural resident social media usage. You can see, you know, it was low down here in 2006 and how it's crept up, and also how close it is to this dark blue line, which is our urban, and then the I guess that's like a light green line, the suburban. You know, they are just, rural residents are just slightly behind these other populations on social media usage. So they are very, very active. Our rural communities are very, very active online. One question I get asked a lot is, what social media platforms do rural people use the most? You know, where are they? What are they on? So Facebook and YouTube tend to be kind of the cornerstone of a rural population social media strategy. To give you some insights, Facebook usage, 73% of US adults from urban areas use Facebook, and 66% of adults in rural areas use Facebook. So not that big of a spread there, pretty close in numbers. YouTube, 77% of US adults in urban areas use YouTube, and 64% of US adults in rural areas use YouTube. You know, but Facebook and YouTube, while they are the most popular social media platforms in rural areas, they're not the only ones that you need to consider. There are a lot of millennials and Gen Zers residing in rural areas. And with those two generations, you're going to want to consider platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. You want to be where your community that you're trying to reach, you know, is online. Another interesting rural social media kind of factoid, according to Pew, rural populations actually have higher usage of the social media app Pinterest than urban or suburban populations. They use Pinterest more than their urban and suburban counterparts. I've thought over this and talked to a few people trying to figure out why. Why do rural populations use Pinterest at such high rates? And I think some of it goes back to those key differences in lifestyle between rural and urban and suburban areas. If you remember back from our intro to rural populations, rural community members are more likely to own their home than people living in urban areas. They also start families sooner. They also have limited restaurant options. And so if you can think about that lifestyle and then you compare it to what is evident or what goes on, what type of content is on Pinterest, to me, it makes sense. On Pinterest, you've got a lot of do-it-yourself projects, make furniture, redesign your room, organize your laundry, laundry closet. These things, these DIY projects are very suitable to homeowners. A lot of parenting and kid-focused activity content on Pinterest. Rural populations are starting families sooner. This is a key priority for them. Less restaurants means more cooking at home. Pinterest is a wealth of recipes. That's my number one use of Pinterest is recipes. And so I think kind of that provides an example for, you really have to understand the lifestyle and the specific needs of residents in rural areas. And then you can kind of backtrack and think about, okay, here's what's going on in their mind. Here's what's keeping them up at night. Here are their challenges. And where are they going online to solve those problems? So I do want to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has impacted rural life, but specifically with social media. So rural residents are spending more time online than ever before. This usage really skyrocketed during the pandemic. Social media has served as a lifeline for rural residents throughout the pandemic. On multiple fronts, residents could use social media to get assistance, to find nonprofits and government programs that were offering assistance. We're using social media to find new jobs. They've used social media to get information specific to the natural or the disaster, the emergency situation with the pandemic. This includes things like connecting with vaccine clinics, keeping track of, okay, what symptoms are we looking for? When do we go to the doctor? And up to date on closures of schools and businesses in the area. The situation with the pandemic was changing so fast. In my small community that I live in, we have a printed newspaper that comes out once a week, so every 7 days. And then we have another paper that comes out once a month. So if we were stuck waiting on those papers to provide us information on the pandemic, we would be, kind of up creek without a paddle there, because the situation was so rapidly changing. And so social media provided this awesome outlet, this true lifeline for rural residents that were trying to navigate, this incredibly challenging situation. And then also in the pandemic, social media, and this is not restricted just, to rural residents per se, but social media provided an awesome avenue of socialization while many of us were, social distancing for public health reasons. Unfortunately, many rural areas remain ravaged by the ongoing effects of the pandemic. And so I think we will, continue to see social media being used with this intent, for assistance, job searches, information, and socialization for several years to come. And I personally, my opinion is that this increase in usage of social media, incorporating social media into their habits, their daily life, rural residents, isn't something that's going to go away when we're on the other side of the pandemic. I think, kind of the connectivity that social media provides rural residents will be hard to replicate in other forms, and I think it's gonna stay. So the way rural residents approach social media and relationships in general is a bit different from what may be observed in more urban areas. So I wanted to talk about this just so you kind of have this, this orientation before we talk about, putting together an effective rural informed social media strategy. So in urban areas, weak relationship ties are prioritized, or are observed as being prioritized. And these type of weak, more shallow relationships provide access to non-redundant information found outside of the network or a network of really strong ties. Rural communities, rural populations often prefer strong social ties over weak ones. So things that are prioritized in rural communities tend to be community characteristics such as teamwork, working together, supporting each other, pulling together, cooperation between everyone, banding together. In other words, rural communities value bonding, they value collectiveness, as opposed to kind of more of a self-interest individual approach to relationships. Another interesting observation is that rural residents tend to live closer in proximity to their social media friends when compared to urban residents. And I think this speaks to the strong ties that exist within a rural community, and also the hyper localness of influence and information that is observable within a rural community. When it comes to marketing, this is just super important to recognize, because it suggests that rural residents may be more likely to respond to and trust information that comes from someone they know or someone from the same or similar community as theirs. So, social media initiatives need to be customized, if they're going to be effective, to the rural community itself. What works in an urban area, even if that urban area is close to the rural community, may not be effective in reaching rural populations. So recognizing these key differences in online behavior can assist in the development of a rural informed outreach strategy. These differences, how the role social media plays, the problems that it solves in rural life is really key here. As you think about how your organization's social media can build these connections in rural communities, strengthen relationships, and get the word out about your programs and your support services. Okay. Now we're going to get into creating an effective strategy for marketing or connecting with rural populations via social media. So, kind of as with all marketing strategies, organizations need to have a plan. They need to do some research specific to the communities that they're interested in serving. So while there are some observable similarities in, urban versus suburban versus rural, there are some key differences. We talked about a few today, but there are also some key differences between rural community versus rural community. Every community, rural community, is unique in its culture, its history, and population. So understanding, the target audience on a community-based and community-specific level is imperative for organizations interested in developing an effective social media campaign or strategy. Here's just kind of a few tips for how you can get to know rural communities. The trick here with market research with rural communities is, you're not going to have a lot of data specific to the rural communities that you're targeting. They tend to be smaller, less populated than urban areas. If you were trying to find market research on a big city, let's just say Alexandria, Virginia, or Richmond, Virginia, if you were trying to find that data, it is readily available. If you are interested in the small little mountain town of Clifton Forge, Virginia, there's not going to be a lot of data related to the market readily available for you. So you do have to have a plan for getting to know these communities and collecting data and making sure that the social media content, the social media engagement strategies you're using fit for the audience that you're trying to connect with. So recognize, that every community has some differences, and avoid making inaccurate assumptions about audiences. We want to be data driven. We want to be informed before we put together a strategy. So there's a couple ways to conduct market research specific to rural communities. I think when people think about market research, they tend to think about published data related to populations, and then also collecting relevant data from online surveys. And so we're not going to have as much of that access, or really even cost-effective access for that with rural communities. So there's a few other things you can do. Community discussion, town halls, that type of thing can provide you a lot of insight into the community's culture, history, and population, their values, what keeps them up at night. You can meet with community leaders and community influencers. And then obviously you can, collect relevant data that is published through surveys and publications. But honestly, this is one of those parts where, kind of boots on the ground is going to be one of your better bets on really getting to know the community. Also, you can incorporate community listening strategies into your overall social media approach. And this can help you stay up to date on current events, and you can adjust your market research, regarding community member attitudes, priorities, and values that may change. Community listening approaches can take multiple forms. You can do it digitally, if you have an active social media presence there, or email list. You can do it digitally. You can bring in those community leaders, community influencers, assemble focus groups. And then also, just kind of getting involved, whether that's, showing up once a month, talking to people, going to the county fair, talking to people, engaging the community kind of in a way that may go a little bit beyond the screen, can really provide you some valuable data. And while there are community differences, in my work, I have noticed that rural communities, culture, concerns, or challenges, there is a regional component to that. And so, chances are one community struggles they're facing, then rural community 70 miles away in the same region may be facing similar struggles. So I think it is important to identify, region-specific rural challenges, and in culture, but then also recognize that you do need to take a community specific approach and kind of whittle that out for each community. So an integrated marketing approach works best when reaching rural populations. So this includes social media. One way, if you really want to, I guess, for lack of a better word, bang for your buck on social media effectiveness, is to pair it in an integrated marketing strategy with other options. So things like traditional media, this could be printed materials, this could be radio, newspaper, billboards. You also pair it with digital marketing initiatives, things like social media, internet-based advertisements, and landing pages. Website landing pages can be a great way for organizations that serve a wide variety of population, like urban, suburban, and rural, to create a landing page specific to a rural region that they're interested in, connecting with, and making sure all the creative assets, all the images, all the video, all the copy reflect that rural community, that rural region. People are more likely to engage and trust organizations that marketing materials reflect them, that reflect their life, that's something they look at and they say, oh, I can see myself in this. So making sure you have that kind of differentiated yet integrated marketing strategy to support the social media initiatives can be really helpful. And then also a key component with rural outreach is publicity. So things like media interviews, even podcasts with regional influencers, podcast interviews. What this provides is kind of like, it's like a vetting. It's a vetted, introduction to rural residents between the organization and rural residents, facilitated by a trusted source. This could be a journalist with a newspaper. It could be a favorite radio personality, or even, an area blogger. It's a vetted source. This type of introduction is something that is extremely valuable, but all too often neglected when organizations are thinking about creating a social media strategy to reach rural residents. All too often, they just want to talk about, what are we going to post? What are we going to post? We're going to post pretty pictures. We're going to post, funny videos, and we're gonna use a lot of hashtags, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. On a truly effective social media strategy and an integrated marketing approach to support that social media strategy, it's important. I think it's important with any target audience that you're trying to approach, but it is especially important when you're trying to reach rural communities. So you remember a few slides prior, rural communities really prize that hyper-localness, those strong ties. And this kind of plays into why it is so important for, new organizations coming in to be introduced to the rural area, to the rural population through a trusted source, like the newspaper, like influencers, like radio hosts, community leaders. And then the rural population can go onto your organization's social media sites or the landing page that you created, to, inform of the programs and how they relate to, enhancing how they can assist in enhancing the quality of life in these rural areas specific to this audience. So that kind of just brings it all home. So while, it is just so important, to understand your target audience, understand their values, understand their behaviors, you're going to want to take time and kind of whittle out that research specific to rural communities. Just remember, all rural communities are not the same. They have key differences. And, you want to approach it dismantling misconceptions, dismantling stereotypes, and recognize social media residents are very active online. They use social media a little bit differently than the majority of residents in urban and suburban areas. And they also take a different approach. They have different priorities that are observed in relation to which organizations they trust, how they build trust with organizations, and how relationships and networking play a part in that process. So I know today's webinar covered a lot, and I appreciate you hanging in there. I did want to show you real quickly. For additional information, you can visit our website at Aboutcker-digital.com. And if you go up to the resources tab, there's a lot of stuff. So we've got a blog, a newsletter. You can sign up for that if you're interested in it. We send a newsletter out once a month. We don't spam. It's just once a month. Here's upcoming webinars. Here's the blog posts. It's just kind of like a consolidated resource list. We also have a podcast where last season we did a interview about rural marketing, that if this is interesting to you, there's a little more on that. And then Operation Influence is our influencer network. And then our webinars, you can access past recordings for webinars that we've hosted previously. All of those are free. And then also we have webinars that are coming up you can register for. So next month we have 508 compliance, disability inclusive communications. And then November, we have a webinar on connecting with the military and veteran community. I am super excited about that because it ties in so well with our rural webinar and discussion. If you remember from the very first section, 10.4% of rural populations, adults, are veterans. They are veterans. So having and making sure you have a military and veteran friendly outreach strategy is so important for rural social media effectiveness. So if that's something you'd like to learn about, that webinar will be in November, and you can sign up, register for that. There's a link on the website. If you have any questions about stuff we went over today, or you'd like more information on something, or if I can help you out, feel free to email me, hannah@aboutcker-digital.com. Our company is available to support your organization's social media, communications, outreach needs. You can reach out to us online to schedule a discovery call, or, or we can just, it's complimentary. We can talk about your organization, its mission, what you're looking at, where, kind of where you want to be. And we can help figure out how to get you there. Social media itself is a dynamic platform, always changing. There's always new stuff coming out. And so I commend you, to spending, almost an hour today investing on continuing education for that. And it is just so important to stay on top of social media and digital trends. I tell people the only thing constant about social media is that it's always changing. So anyway, thank you again for attending the webinar, and I hope you have a wonderful day.